Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. Thank you for joining us today for the virtual regional launch of the 2020 ALICE report. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. All participants are muted. Please ask any questions you might have in the chat box, either during the presentation or during the Q&A at the end. And finally, the ALICE report, links to the website, and any salient materials will be emailed after this webinar concludes. So please bear with us another minute or two while we let everyone in from the waiting room. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for bearing with us. We are still admitting people from the waiting room. We're up to about 170 or some odd participants at the moment. We had 350 registrants, so we're about halfway there, but we'll get started shortly, I promise you. Thank you for waiting. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Gabrielle, the President and CEO of the United Way of Westchester and Putnam. On behalf of my colleagues, Jeannie Montano, the President and CEO of the United Way of Dutchess-Orange Region, as well as Dana Tracy, President and CEO of the United Way of Rockland, and all of their staff, I'm delighted to welcome you to the virtual regional launch of the 2020 ALICE report here in our 5 counties. There are over 350 registrants for this presentation, and some are still joining, so please bear with us. As a quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded. All participants are muted. Please ask any questions you might have in the chat box, either during the presentation or during the Q&A at the end. And the ALICE report, as well as links to the website, any salient materials, etc., will be emailed after this webinar. For those that aren't familiar with the term, ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. At its core, it's a new way of defining and understanding the struggles of households that earn just above the federal poverty level, but not enough for a survival budget. ALICE families struggle to meet even the most basic needs, such as housing, food, transportation, childcare, healthcare, and necessary technology. And when funds run short, these families are forced to make impossible choices between childcare, or filling a prescription, or fixing a car. The ALICE research began more than a decade ago as a study to understand the struggles of families in one New Jersey county. Today, ALICE research has grown to include hundreds of United Ways and corporations and foundations across 20 states in an effort to change the national dialogue around financial hardship. Here in New York, the ALICE report is conducted and led by the United Way of New York State, which is a membership organization of local United Ways. In addition to the ALICE New York report, the United Way of New York State also conducts public policy on behalf of its member United Ways, as well as coordinates 211 New York, a free information resource for people seeking assistance. This morning, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague and friend, Brenda Episcopo, who will present today's webinar on the ALICE New York research. Brenda is the President and CEO of the United Way of New York State and has led the ALICE New York research here. Since childhood, Brenda's vision has always been to make the world a better place. I'm right there with you, Brenda. She knows that the best way to achieve this mission is by engaging the community and creating solutions that work. With 20 years of experience in the nonprofit field, Brenda is especially known for developing and leading programs in response to community need. She has a Master's of Science degree in Applied Sociology from the State University of New York and is a graduate of an exclusive United Way Executive Leadership Development Program, which involved training at the Center for Creative Leadership, Harvard Executive Education, and Deloitte University. So on behalf of my colleagues from the United Ways in Dutchess, Orange, and Rockland counties, Brenda, the audience is all yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to all of you chiming in good mornings in the chat box. It's great to see so many people here to hear about ALICE in your 5-county region. And it's particularly exciting to see some familiar faces in the participant list who've been longtime friends of United Way. So thank you all for making the time to be here this morning. So let's get started. Our agenda today, we're going to talk about who is ALICE, what's new in the 2020 report, highlights from the same report, and a COVID-19 look ahead at the impact on ALICE households and beyond. Just a note about the 2020 report, you'll hear us talk about the 2020 ALICE report. This report is based on 2018 data. That is the most complete data set that's available at this time, and really sheds a light on which households we should particularly watch as we move into our COVID response, reimagining, recovery, and rebuilding efforts in our local communities. As Tom mentioned, United for ALICE is a nationwide project incorporating 25 states in the US. Although data is available for all 3,000 counties in the US, 25 states that have engaged will have the level of data that we're going to show you about today. It's based on a research team. It started from Rutgers University and United Way in Northern New Jersey, and they put together a rubric that could more accurately measure what we used to call the working poor. And one of the goals of the ALICE project is to change that vernacular from the working poor to ALICE households, to conduct research and produce these reports, to lead learning communities and inspire action to improve the financial stability of ALICE households and their communities. I have to give a quick thanks to our sponsors of the ALICE report. This work is brought to you by 34 local United Ways, Key Bank, NBT Bank, and CSEA. So we thank them all for their partnership in allowing us to have this conversation today. So who is ALICE? Tom talked about the definition of ALICE. The acronym stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. These are households that are above the federal poverty level, but unable to meet a basic household survival budget. We're going to dig into each of these terms a little bit this morning. Primarily working low-wage jobs that are so prolific in our state, including cashiers, healthcare workers, security guards, laborers, and more. ALICE households have no savings for emergencies or for investing in their future. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means for these households and for our communities. First, I'm going to start with a brief video that will introduce you to ALICE.
I met Charlene about 20 years ago. She was Student of the Month. I went to her high school graduation, and I think I saw the potential then. And to look at Charlene, she's put together, she's professional, she's articulate, and she's respected. On the outside, it looks like this girl's got it together, and what does she have to worry about? But it's just not that simple. It's hard to see somebody have to fight so hard. I mean, I'm not saying that things have to come easy in life for people, but she fights really hard.
So even though I have this full-time career, it's still a struggle. It's still hard to make ends meet. I'm a divorced mom of 2 boys, ages 10 and 7. They live with me full-time. My 10-year-old son has special needs. He's more demanding and he needs more than just your average kid. I had worked full-time in the banking industry. Due to the birth of our second child, daycare costs exceeded what my salary was, so I quit my job to become a stay-at-home mom. When the divorce occurred, that created an extreme hardship. My parents tapped into their resources, and it was just too much. Too many months had gone by. I had to start putting a lot of bills on credit cards, whether it was the water bill, phone bills. I had to watch my car. It towed away. It wasn't a path I wanted to go down, but I had no choice. So when I was offered the position where I am now, it was the light at the end of the tunnel for me. I love helping other people. It's the way I can provide for my kids, for my family. And it's a job that makes you feel good at the end of the day because you know you're making a difference.
Being able to put your child to college and own a home and own a vehicle and have health insurance and be sustainable. That's the American dream. It's much more difficult than I think most people think.
So now I'm faced with moving my family. After receiving a sheriff's notice, the bank will most likely take the house back. You can't keep a family of 3 afloat on my salary alone. The boys have only ever known this house as theirs. My little guy is more upset about it than the older one. He doesn't want to change his bus stop.
I am rooting for Charlene. I believe in Charlene. I think it's circumstance, that's why she is where she is today. But if we as a society change circumstance and change environment to support one another, then I think we can make those moves. No one does anything alone or in isolation. And what one does impacts somebody else.
If we don't discuss this and we don't talk about it and we don't raise the awareness, it's never going to change. I believe that that's what creates opportunity. And if I have to give a voice, if I have to give a face, then I'm willing to do that because I am Alice.
So that's Charlene, and Charlene is one example of almost half of the households in New York State who struggle paycheck to paycheck. So let's dig into some of the data about just how prevalent is this concept called ALICE and what can we do to help them shore up their financial stability. There's a few key terms you're going to need to be aware of as we look into the data. One is the household survival budget. That's the bare minimum cost of basic necessities. That's how we measure who is Alice. We're going to dig into the budget items, but the household survival budget is that threshold that we are looking for households to be able to meet at a minimum to be considered above the Alice threshold, which is the next concept. The average income needed to afford the survival budget is the threshold. So a household that's below the Alice threshold includes Alice and households in poverty. Alice are those households above the poverty level, but below the survival budget. They're the ones in the pinch. Poverty level are households earning below the federal poverty level. And total households are the number of households as reported by the American Community Survey. Don't worry about memorizing these things. We have visuals that will support each of them as we move forward in our discussions. I want to talk briefly about the sources for the household budget. This is a basic, very minimal budget that it would take to survive in communities across the state and our country. It uses the lowest figures, the lowest accepted data figures from known and vetted sources, and puts them together in a new way that we can use as a construct to measure. This is a survival budget. It is not an ideal budget. There are things not included in this budget. There's no debt repayment, no savings, no retirement contributions, no television or entertainment, no clothing, sports, or supplies for your kids to engage in school, and no student loan repayment, credit cards, etc. This is a basic survival budget. On the website, I'll show you where momentarily, you can find 3 different levels of budgets, including a prosperity budget. But for today and for our work, we focus on the ALICE survival budget. This is what it looks like. Those of you that can see the screen, those of you that cannot, we will send links to you for all of these data sources and visuals so that you can look at them at a later time. This is the ALICE household survival budget for 2018. And across the first column, you will see the budget items: housing, childcare, food, transportation, healthcare, technology, miscellaneous, which is a 10% average of the rest of the budget, taxes, a monthly total, the annual total that would be required to meet this basic budget, and the hourly wage that would be required. For those of you that are very interested in data, there is a report on the website on the methodology behind these numbers. You can dig in all the way down through to the raw data file, as well as the methodology as where these numbers are pulled from. I just want to point out to you before we move off this slide, for a single adult to afford the basic household survival budget in the state of New York, they would need to make $13.66 an hour. Now that's a state average. We're going to show you how these numbers change depending on your county, your region, or your local municipality. And the data is available down to that zip code and municipal level as well. A wage required to support 2 adults and 2 children in childcare would be $39.08 an hour. Those are numbers that we're going to come back to. This is a different way to look at the bare minimum budget. You can see here that the cost of living for ALICE far outpaces the federal poverty level and outpaces wages of one of the most common types of jobs available in New York State, retail sales, which pays on average $11.94 an hour. So moving to this chart, the gray bar in the very beginning is a full-time retail sales person. The next is a household survival budget for 1 adult, a senior citizen household survival budget, which is slightly modified from a working age adult, and the household survival budget for a family of 4. The dotted lines reflect the federal poverty level, so you can see how the ALICE budget compares to the federal poverty level. Added into the second chart, same chart we just looked at, but you'll see 2 blue lines, one at $1,200, one at $3,400. This shows you the Federal CARES Act stimulus check and just how far that goes to a monthly household survival budget. Let's look at your 5 counties specifically. When we take an average of the household survival budgets required for the 5 counties that we're talking about today, which for a quick reminder is Orange, Putnam, Westchester, Dutchess, and Rockland counties, you will see that the numbers shift from the state average quite a bit. A single adult would require $13.66 an hour in a full-time job to support the statewide budget. However, in your 5 counties, that rises to a requirement of $17.76 an hour, 76 cents an hour. And for a family of 4, it rises from $39.08 an hour for statewide average to $49.61 an hour in your 5 counties. We're going to take a look into why living in your 5 counties has a higher than state average cost of living, but my guess is many of you on the call are already aware of this fact. When we look at the 5 counties in New York that we're discussing here, this is how a single adult household monthly survival budget looks when you compare your combined counties to New York State to the federal poverty level. So some of by the colors, you can see some of the areas which are out of proportion for state average. We're going to talk about those further later on, but what jumps out to me is taxes and housing costs. I know if I did a poll right now, a lot of you would not be surprised, but the data clearly shows that creates more of a struggle for ALIS families in your region than the rest of the state. What happens when you add in childcare requirement to that same comparison? 2 adults, 2 children in care, combined counties compared to New York State and the federal poverty level. So just how prevalent is this issue of ALIS in New York State? We have a question in the chat box about Orange County specifically. I'm going to show you how to separate out county level data before we end this webinar today. So we'll definitely get to that question. When you do combine counties, it does change the average of things. Same as when we look at the statewide average. That's why it'll be really important for you to know how to find your county, even municipal level data. I promise you we'll do that before we conclude today. And I am moving my slide ahead. State average. Only 55% of households in New York State are above the ALIS threshold. 14% of them are living in poverty, and 31% of them are ALIS. So why are there so many ALIS households? The cost of living has increased more for ALIS households than for the general population. We're going to talk about the ALIS Essentials Index, which is basically a version of the Consumer Price Index, but only for the things that ALIS buys. And the cost of those items in that survival budget have grown quicker than the cost of other goods. We have a prevalence of low-paying jobs in New York State and high worker vulnerability. And a third trend from the 2020 report is continued growing of ALIS households. While poverty has remained around 14% for many years, ALIS in 2007 was 23%. In 2018, it was 31%. So ALIS households are definitely growing. We use 2007 and 2010 as measuring points for comparison because that was the last major recession. We know from our data, ALIS households never fully recovered. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means for the current COVID pandemic. Why we pay attention to worker vulnerability is because predictable schedules and benefits like health insurance are really becoming in the limelight for importance with the COVID pandemic. This is that average for your 5 counties. Again, we'll show you how to get to your counties separately, but for the 5 counties we're talking about today, 62% of the households are above the ALIS threshold, which is a little bit better than state average of 55. And your poverty rate is a bit lower at 10% compared to state average of 14, but your ALIS numbers are the same. Very interesting. When we look at your 5 counties together, the top 5 places that have the highest below the ALIS threshold include the city of Newburgh at 67%, Poughkeepsie at 63%, Port Jervis at 63%, Peekskill at 61%, and the city of Mount Vernon at 57%. These are the cities in your 5 counties that have the highest percentage of households below the ALIS threshold. We look at ALIS in New York State. This is a different way to look at the data. It's a line graph where you can see that the poverty rate has remained relatively flat, but the ALIS households took a huge jump with the last recession and have continued to grow. The large number of households struggling before the COVID-19 pandemic helps explain why this is so severe. There are other households that do not fall below the ALIS threshold, but they are considered on the cusp of ALIS threshold. And these are folks with income brackets just above and below the ALIS threshold. 15% of households in New York are on the cusp of the ALIS threshold. Why we pay attention to that is because small increases in bills, a decrease in wages or hours, or an unexpected emergency could destabilize a large number of households. I'll be very interested to see in the 2022 report what happened to ALIS households and households on the cusp with the COVID-19 pandemic. We release these reports every 2 years. The 2020 report was our 3rd report. 2022 will make an interesting look back on our current report to see what the numbers show about COVID and our response. The upside of this is conversely, small changes can have a preventative impact to keep households from slipping below the ALICE threshold. And that's where we need to shore up our support programs. This is what a heat map of ALICE households looks like across the state. The darker blue indicates they have a higher below the ALICE threshold percentage. There is ALICE in every county of New York, and it ranges from 28% of households below the ALICE threshold to 66%. We break our report into 3 regions: New York City, rest of state, and the counties surrounding New York City, where your 5 counties fall and are combined with Long Island. There are some clear and compelling reasons why we break our report down into these 3 regions. And so we're going to focus today more on the counties surrounding New York City and specifically York 5. When we look at the counties surrounding New York, you can see that the poverty rate, like the state average, has remained relatively flat around 8% for many, many years. Many would argue we're not doing enough to reduce that poverty rate. Today, we're looking at ALICE households, which have increased. And even though they have dropped back down a little bit below the height of the last recession, they are still above where they were in 2010. Let's look at this a different way. In the middle is your county surrounding New York City, and the lightest shade is the poverty level, the medium shade is ALICE, and the darkest blue shade is above the ALICE threshold. You can see quickly here how you stack up to New York City on the left and rest of state on the right. But even though there are large percentages of households that fall below the ALICE threshold, there are some household types which are disproportionately impacted financially. If I asked you to think right now about what households you think would have an uncharacteristically high percentage below the ALICE threshold, you may be able to name some of them. We saw one in the video, Charlene, as a single female-headed household with children, but let's look at them all. Across the state, to the far right, your anchor percentage, 45% of all households are below the ALICE threshold. Black households are 61% below the ALICE threshold. Hispanic households, 63% below the ALICE threshold. Households headed by a person under the age of 25 years old, not including college students, is 72% of them are below the ALICE threshold. And single female-headed household with children, 3/4 of them are below the ALICE threshold. They're making those difficult choices that Tom talked about, that Charlene showed you. Households of all ages, genders, races, and ethnicities have the ALICE experience, but some have it more. And out of all the households in New York State, these are the ones we need to pay attention to with our recovery and rebuilding efforts. These are the households that'll be more impacted by COVID-19. And the difference is in how well will they be able to survive this instance. ALICE families that don't have savings and they're working hourly are more likely to fall into debt. They may not afford or reach out for treatment when they get sick. They skimp on basic necessities like Tom talked about. Do you fill your prescription or do you buy food that week? Do you go for the COVID test if you're not sure if there's going to be a fee for it? Or do you just ride it out and hope that hope that you don't have COVID? It's really dire with these households. But that's the state average. So let's look at your 5 counties specifically. Again, this data is available at every individual county level. But overall, your 5 counties have a lower percent than state average for total households below ALICE at 38%, but yet your other factors aren't all that different. Half of Black and Hispanic households are below the ALICE threshold in your 5 counties. 84% of households under 25 years old, not counting college students, are below the ALICE threshold. You have the same percentage of single female-headed households with children below ALICE than the state average, even though overall you have fewer households in this category. Most concerning of this data is the households under age 25 our young adults are off to a challenging start in Dutchess-Orange, Putnam, Rockland, and Westchester counties. So what happens to a 23-year-old who is out on their own and they can't afford the basics? I talked to you a little bit earlier about the ALICE Essentials Index. This is the basic household items that ALICE families buy, pulled out of the General Consumer Price Index. We all know the price of general goods has been rising. It's been rising 1.8% a year for many years. But the ALICE Essentials have been rising in cost 3.4%. And that's similar across rural and urban areas. The high cost of goods is one reason why we have so many ALICE households. Another reason why is we have a prevalence of low-wage jobs in New York State. Low-wage workers have increased unemployment and lost hours in wages, the tally of which we'll be very interested to see. The graph that you're looking at in front of you right now is wages versus the household survival budget for the state. Since 2007, the gold line here is a measurement of when you can support the family of four household survival budget with one job. With one job, do the wages support that family budget? The number of those jobs has been dropping. The medium blue line is a job that can support a family of four with two earners. Thankfully, there has been some growth in those jobs in our state. And the dark blue line is the job that cannot support a family household survival budget, even with two earners, and look at the growth that we've experienced. There's a question in the chat box. Will you be sharing where this data comes from? Absolutely, yes, and I'm going to show you how to find it. Also, we'll be following up with an email to you as well. So this chart always fascinates me. I'm sharing it so you can take a scan through it for a moment. The top 20 occupations by employment and wage in New York State for 2018. Just as an anchor point, remember, a single adult would require $13.66 an hour, and a senior would require $15.20 an hour. And the family numbers are there as well. What's interesting, this is the top 10. Retail sales, personal care aides, cashiers, home health aides, janitors and cleaners, food prep, office clerks. What do you notice about those top 5 or 6 jobs of New York State? How were they impacted by COVID? These were some of the first jobs to be furloughed, and they will be among the last to come back online in a major way. But let's look at the second batch as well. Operations managers, laborers, teachers' aides, security guards, supervisors, stock clerks, accountants, and auditors. What's interesting out of all of these is only 3 of the top 20 most common jobs in New York State could afford a household survival budget for a family of 4 on one job. Only 3 out of the top 20. 14 out of 20 could support a single adult. So that means 6 jobs out of the top 20 most popular jobs in New York could not even support a single adult, which forces them to take on second and third jobs in some of these industries, which leads us to COVID's disruption. But before we get there, I want to take a look at the landscape of work. There's a data set that I'll show you how to get to that talks about who's in the workforce. More than half of the jobs in 2018 were hourly jobs. Only 24% of working age adults had a full-time job with a salary. This matters because full-time jobs are the ones that bring some stability for your budget planning, because you know you're going to have predictable hours, benefits like health insurance and paid sick leave. 37% were out of the labor force, either due to retirement or because they have a disability or they're unable to work, or because, like Charlene mentioned, the cost of childcare outpaced her wages. And so for a time she was out of the labor force to care for her children. Some people are caring for parents. Hourly jobs make it really hard when you talk about the digital divide. It's not as easy to do those jobs online, remotely. We have the added cost of the crisis when public transportation shuts down. How are people getting to work? And almost 40% of workers have a side gig. And so those hours have been cut as well. Let's look at your 5 counties briefly. This is the data on your 5 counties. I'll show you where to find it on the website. Somewhat similar, only half the jobs, more than half the jobs were paid hourly, and only a quarter of working age adults had a full-time salary job. But in your 5 counties, 39% were out of the labor force. That's something to take a look at. There's a question in the chat box about heads of households, young adults who are on their own or head of household. Yes, it's young adults who are a head of household. That does not include students. And is there a source to get income on poverty and ALICE impacts from COVID? I'm going to show you the sources that I know. The data has not been fully analyzed yet. In your 5 counties, it's interesting also to look at the employment by firm size in your 5 counties. Large firms tend to pay higher wages, offer better benefits, provide more stability, and weather changes better than small businesses. However, you can see the darkest blue is your small business network as far as how many jobs they bring to your community. You're doing fairly well in the large firm category, but it's always good to pay attention to. A couple of trends I want to highlight before I start digging into showing you the website where you can find this data, and we will conclude with a little bit of discussion about COVID and a look ahead for ALICE and how you can get involved. That's where we're going from here. There are some trends to take note of in our report. The risk of automation is very high for low-wage jobs. If you have ever gone into a fast food restaurant and placed your own order on a kiosk, that is one example of a low-wage job being automated. There's a strong correlation between the jobs that pay less than $20 an hour have a higher likelihood to be replaced by technology. At the same time, there is a growth of low-wage jobs which require workers to interact more with technology, which brings an interesting workforce development component to the table. There has been an ongoing growth of the gig economy. Remote work is going to facilitate that even further, and the growth of reliance on digital technology should innovate around that. But what's interesting in the growth of the gig economy is what happened to gig jobs during COVID. And people who've been relying on a gig economy for their income have not largely been eligible for a lot of the relief efforts that have been made available. And working students, there is a trend among working students and a huge trend in food insecurity among college-age students, something that we're paying attention to in our report. So let's look at an example of data in action. On the website, which I'm going to show you in about 3 minutes, there is a section called Data for Action, where we remap libraries with households below the ALICE threshold. So what you see here is an example of Orange County, and we can use these kinds of data points to make decisions and identify gaps in resources. Prior to COVID, and I'm imagining still, libraries provide a great resource for working families, access to reliable internet and computers and programming and job search support and more. So one of the data points that are mapped here are, where are the libraries in comparison to ALICE families? Then we move to internet access, hot topic. So relevant, more than it ever has been, but for years, advocates have been concerned about the digital divide. We have mapped internet access to ALICE households on the website, and that's defined as having a paid internet subscription. We all know that in New York State, having an internet subscription does not guarantee reliable speeds or service that's required for telework, video participation, and remote learning. So we have 2 issues. We have access to internet and affordability of internet. Over the last 3 decades, 91% of adults have owned a computing device, but it still varies by income and geography. Low-income adults are more likely to own a smartphone than to have broadband internet access, while 90% of those that earn $100,000 or more have both. And for many families, that relates directly to reduced job opportunities, healthcare access, and financial tools. Have you ever taken your phone out and tried to update your resume, apply for a job online, and upload your resume? That simple task alone is nearly impossible when your only access to the internet is via a phone. I want to stop and peek at the chat box really quickly before I move to the next slide. We have some good comments in here we're going to come back to. I know Tom is moderating the chat box for our discussion. Thank you. Thank you for your input about these jobs that are available and your experiences. I really do appreciate this. And this is exactly what we're talking about. There are benefits to moving towards equity. And there's an analysis that quantifies the contribution of ALICE and poverty households to the GDP of New York State. What would happen if all households earned enough to meet basic needs? Not only would their hardship be eased, but the state's economy would grow. COVID-19 is revealing the converse. When the number of households that cannot meet their basic needs increases substantially, economic hardship goes all across the board. And so, very interesting. I'm going to talk about a couple of those impacts right now. There is a report I'm going to show you too called The Consequences of Insufficient Income, and another report called The Benefits of Sufficient Income. And it takes a look at each of the budget items and what the impacts are on the individual household as well as on the wider community. Let me give you an example. Housing. When ALICE has stable and reliable housing that they can afford, they are healthier, they have less access to lead paint and mold and some of the things that are prevalent in low-income housing, decreased stress, it's better educational performance for their children when they're not moving every 8 to 9 months, greater stability for the household members, and they actually can build some wealth by homeownership. For the community, this means less traffic because fewer people are commuting farther, lower healthcare costs in general, better housing stock, lower crime rates, and less spending on social services. Of the 5 counties on the call today, could you guess which county has the highest housing cost for a family of 4? Putnam, $2,110 a month compared to the state average of $1,091 a month, almost double. Childcare, huge impact. Top headline news right now, as it should be. Childcare impacts ALICE families when they have access to reliable childcare. The kids are safer, they do better in school, they have a higher lifetime earnings, higher graduation rates, improved job stability for the parents. It's better overall. For the community, when we have high quality childcare for all kids, we have decreased racial and ethnic and socioeconomic performance gaps, decreased income disparity, and a high return on investment, especially for early childhood education. Could you guess which county has the highest childcare costs for a family of 4 with 2 kids in care? Westchester, $2,448 a month compared to the state average of $1,485 a month. Not quite double, but getting pretty close. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for. How do I get my hands on my local data? We have a website, unitedforalice.org. I'm gonna click right through to it right now. And then I'm going to minimize the chat for a moment so I can expand the screen that you all see. So you can see what I'm talking about here. Unitedforalice.org. I happen to be on New York's page. Across the top banner, you will see how COVID impacts ALICE. Learn more. Click here, and that's where you will be able to find data as it becomes available about the impact of COVID on ALICE and poverty households. The consequences report that I just mentioned 2 examples of, you can dig into the overview and each of the budget items here. Consequences of insufficient income are available here. There are 2 bars. I'm going to show you what's in there, and we're going to dig into a little bit. The national overview for all the states is available here. You can select whichever state you want to mine your data for. We are already on the New York State. ALICE Essentials Index is the data and the methodology behind the Essentials Index measurement. Methodology is here. For those of you that want to dig in and know where did the housing number for Putnam County come from, you can dig into the methodology report right here and find the answer to all those questions, as well as down here, if you can see my mouse wiggling, lower right-hand corner, there's a data sheet. That's a raw data file. You can play around with the data to your heart's content. All of our previous reports can be found here, and there's a picture right to your right-hand side of the New York 2020 report. It's a robust report with all the trends, data, figures, charts, and graphs that you could ever want to download. It's also available on our website at United Way of New York State. If you forget, you Google United Way Alice, you're not gonna miss it. Over to the right is a little pop-out box of those key terms that I introduced you to at the beginning. So if you're reading along and you forgot what that means, you can click over there to remind yourself. On the state overview, you can find many of the things that we have talked about today all in one place. The poverty ALICE and above the ALICE threshold rates, the 3 trends that I talked about, the heat map of ALICE households in our state. And you can see that number by county in this pop-out box below. ALICE and poverty over time with different measuring points from 2018 all the way back to 2010. A different way to look at that same data. And our sponsors. If you like this report and you want to show somebody, but you don't want them to have to go to the website, there's a printer icon right here on the right-hand side that will export this to a PDF. You can save it, print it, email it, whatever you want to do with it, which is pretty great. Now I want to show you how you can dig into the demographics. Remember, we talked about some households have a disproportionate rate of ALICE. This is how you can look at your county. For example purposes today, we're going to look at Rockland County. Type in Rockland, pop it right up. If I wanted to look at all 5 of your counties, I could type them all in right here. You can make any combination you want. I'm just going to pull Rockland County for our demonstration purposes. This is what the ALICE threshold looks like for families with children in Rockland County. These are married families with children, single female-headed household, single male-headed household, and total households. Very interesting how when you dissect things by demographics, you can really get specific. Single male-headed households with children in Rockland County have over a 75% poverty rate. Wow. And you can click on it to see there are 326 of those households in Rockland County. You can get really specific. The difference in ALICE households by age, again, choose your county. This is Rockland we're looking at. You can break it down by age. Why we like to do that is because there are service providers on this call that focus on senior population, that focus on young adults, that focus on the workforce between 25 and 64 years of age. Interesting to see that it varies widely by age. Race and ethnicity, we talked a little bit about, but you can see it here in the numbers as well. And those are the factors that you can pull for your county for demographics, again, just by typing them into this search box at the top. Moving across the right, we're getting a lot of chat box action going on. I can see it flashing in my periphery. I'm going to come back and answer your questions, I promise. Household budgets. This is where you can click and find all of the household budgets that we talked about. We talked about the survival budget today, and you can pull this by your county. So you're going to want to do that. And then you can make it a PDF and share it with the world. Labor force is where we looked at what percentage of your labor force is hourly, salaried, out of the workforce. All of that data is available here by your county. Resource gaps and indicators are the libraries and the internet that we talked about. And the last thing I want to show you for right now is county profiles. You can pull a profile for every county. We're going to pick Dutchess County for our example right now. Just scroll down, pick Dutchess County. Again, make it a PDF and send it with everyone you know in Dutchess County. It will show you your population and households. And compared to your state average, it will show you your county's median income, unemployment rate in 2018, remember. Alice households and households in poverty. How has it changed over time in your county? Percentage in poverty, Alice, and above the Alice threshold over time. Household compositions and who is struggling the most. Why do so many households struggle? Here are all of the various budgets that you could pull for your county all in one place. On the budgets tab, there is a way to change the composition of the household. Let's say one of these standard ones doesn't fit the scenario you're trying to target. You need 2 adults and 4 kids, or maybe you need 3 adults and 1 kid. There is a way to customize the budget for any household composition you can imagine on the budgets tab. And the labor landscape, the heat map for your county, where you can drill down into municipal levels. Here you can see highest in Poughkeepsie, lowest in LaGrange. I think that's how you say that. You can do subdivision, census place, or zip code here. So you can get really, really specific. Just a note, if there are fewer than 100 households that fall within the category, they do not get mapped to protect the confidentiality of those people. And then down here, your county and town list. Very exciting. County profile information without you having to do any work at all to pull what you want together. It provides one nice snapshot in one place. So I'm going to pause for a moment and check the chat box, because if there are questions specifically related to the website here, Tom, are there questions specific to the website that I could go back to? You can all see the chat box now, right? Let me move that. Lots of good information here. We will be saving the chat box. A lot of good ideas in here when we get to discussion. Thank you. White household category for demographics does not include Hispanic households. Hispanic households have its own categorization. People with disabilities are often overlooked. Absolutely. Absolutely, 100% agree. I would venture to say that if we had a reliable data source for exactly households with people with disabilities, we would see that they will hugely fall below the Alice threshold and most likely into poverty, and we need to pay attention to that. How was this data obtained? Again, I'm going to direct you back right here to the methodology section of the website, which talks about the methodology for the report. It will show you every single data source and where it was curated. There was no data created here. This data was curated and put into this format. So I would direct you right to the methodology section of the website. I'm going to drop it in the chat. So I'm going to drop it to everyone in the meeting so that you all can have it if you want it. Thank you for that question. Everybody wants to know. And if anyone here is interested in a follow-up conversation about the research specifically, we are happy to engage in that conversation. We have a research advisory committee for New York State, which actually has several members from the Lower Hudson Valley. And we have a national research advisory committee that oversees the work of the professional paid research team. Yes, please use ALICE data in your grant writing. Those of you that work for nonprofits, use it, use it, use it, especially in your grant applications to your local United Ways. Workforce development issues. Have we looked at the unemployment data for adults 55 plus who have been out of the labor market and the impact? In the ALICE report, we look at who is out of the labor force, and we can look at that data by age, but we have not cross-compared that to unemployment data, especially recently, which I highly recommend. The 2020 report is based on 2018 data. In 2022, we will release the report that is based on 2020 data. And why that is because, as I mentioned, we do not create new data. We curate available data and package it in this way. So we have to wait till that data is solid, analyzed, and published. So it's a 2-year cycle. Can you identify what factors are causing the disparities? Interesting. Yes, we will come back to that question during discussion phase. Thank you for asking that question. We've been paying close attention to this since day one. Thank you. We have an advisory committee member on the chat. Thank you very much for all of your work. Has this information been presented to the business community? Yeah, then there's a question in the chat box about how do we navigate the discussion with businesses that are already struggling. What if we had to pay a higher minimum wage, for example? And I'm going to defer that question to your local United Ways when we get to the discussion phase. It's an important one to have. This is a huge leap forward from previous reports. Thank you, Allison, for chatting that in the box. It is. And the website making the data available to everybody. To go in and mine your own data and run cross comparisons is really a helpful tool. Can we have a recording of this training? We will be sharing all of that with you. Thank you. Oh, we have Mary Shaheen from United Way New York State's on the line with us today, making me aware that Joe is a member of the Research Advisory Committee for ALICE, and he's on the webinar today. Thank you for being here. I can't wait to hear from you after the fact, how exciting it is to see all the work that you put in on the front end and see it presented on the other side. Thank you. Are we making predictions based on what this data will look like after COVID? They are starting to make predictions with the research team, yes. And I would, again, encourage you how COVID impacts ALICE. That's where you can stay attuned to as that data comes out. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to my slide deck here for a moment so that we can talk specifically about COVID, because that is the last phase before we get into Q&A. I have to change my screen here to show the website, so give me a moment. Now, those of you that are into current data, you're going to cringe with me for a moment on the COVID data. This data was curated back in April and May, so it's already changed. But the point that the data drives home has not changed, and that's why it's still relevant that we use this series of 3 slides until the data is updated. Originally, any solid line was actual data and any dotted line was a projection, because we know that from past disasters, there are some things that are predictable following a disaster or a financial crisis that we should pay attention to as it relates to ALICE. So the first prediction made was what would be the cumulative deaths related to COVID-19. And that was based on a project of independent health research out of the University of Washington Medicine. Again, we will send you all the links to the original research about this. But if we, for the sake of the point that we're going to make here, if we understand that this was a projection and it will be updated, we would see a sharp jump in the death toll related to COVID up through 3/4 of the way through the year 2020, but that would level off right through 2022. We will have some level of COVID death toll through 2022. Add to that the unemployment rate. And the ALICE team divided occupations into low and high wage jobs based on their ability to support the household survival budget. Looking at low wage jobs, they then estimated unemployment levels for their sector. And again, these will be updated, but based on determination of essential and degree of public interaction. So unemployment of low wage jobs is this yellow arch here. And you can see that even after we hit the peak and unemployment starts to decline, the year 2022, we are still far higher than when we started with unemployment. This is a long-term struggle for ALICE households. This is not going to be quickly resolved. Let's complicate things further with the emotional index. COVID-19 is unprecedented. We don't have another pandemic in recent times that we can say, here's what we learned from the last one 5 years ago. but we can adapt the emotional index developed by Zunin and Myers to show the highs and lows that typically follow a disaster. Phase 1 pre-disaster is when the warnings come for COVID-19. When China and Italy were having their COVID outbreaks, that was a warning for what was coming to the US. Phase 2 is the impact, a range of intense emotional reactions from shock to panic, confusion and disbelief, followed by self-preservation and family protection. This is where we saw people stocking up on cleaning supplies, hoarding medicine, stocking up on food, and this typically has been the shortest phase of the 6 phases of disaster. We all know now that is not going to remain the case. Phase 3 is the heroic phase, high level of activity, lots of altruism. There's adrenaline-induced rescue behavior. People are running out to volunteer to deliver food. They're bringing toilet paper to their neighbors. Major sweeping legislation gets passed. Lots of fundraising for COVID. And then we pass into phase 4, the honeymoon phase, typically characterized by a shift in emotion because assistance is available. Communities are bonding, optimism is out there, and there are lots of opportunities to access help. And then comes phase 5, disillusionment, and it's a stark contrast to the helping phase. Communities, nonprofits, and individuals realize the limits of assistance. Stress takes a toll, and exhaustion, substance abuse, domestic violence rises. We are seeing these phases commingle with each other. The increasing gap between needs and assistance leads to feelings of abandonment that can last for months or years, and they're often exacerbated by triggering events, which we are seeing on the news on a daily basis. Coronavirus outbreaks, what happens when there's immunization, and so on. Phase 6 is reconstruction or recovery, and this is when people begin to assume responsibility for rebuilding whatever the new normal is while continuing to grieve their losses. This is likely to last for years. There are a few lessons we can pull from Superstorm Sandy in the last Great Recession about Alice families, who are more vulnerable than the general population. For example, during Sandy, Alice families lived in neighborhoods that were prone to flooding. You all have just experienced another round of storm damage. Alice families typically don't have the things they need to survive just that without COVID on top of it. They're losing wages to deal with damages. Their hourly wage jobs are canceled. There's no electricity, road closures. They don't have savings or flood insurance or storm insurance to weather this mini disaster in the midst of a pandemic. During the Great Recession, Alice workers lost their job and savings, and many of them lost their homes. Second, it takes Alice families longer to recover. During Superstorm Sandy, Alice families had to move away from their homes, spend their meager savings on travel and remote housing. Some waited months for their jobs to come back. With COVID, some are still waiting for their jobs to come back. Alice homeowners still had not returned to their homes 6 years after the storm, and after the Great Recession, unemployment remained above 8% until 2012. And while many Alice workers were rehired a year or two after, the new jobs paid lower wages. And third, disillusionment is especially hard for Alice families. Lots of funds are quickly established, but you can realize quickly as time goes on, expenses are accumulating and the aid that's available is not enough to meet the needs. And still to this day, Alice workers' wages never recovered from the last financial disaster. So what do we do about it? Statewide, our local United Way is engaged in advocacy around a few issues that are particularly important to Alice. And we've been advocating for increase in federal SNAP to make sure that people are not going hungry. We've been working to expand the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit to get more money back in the pockets of working people. These are tax credits that they've earned, and we'd like to see them expanded. Currently, workers under the age of 25 are not eligible for the earned income tax credit. And you've all seen head of household numbers below the Alice threshold. For those same workers, they need to get access to the tax credit. It's just one example. We're working at this on the state and federal level. The universal charitable tax deduction is something we've been working on federally with United Ways around the country and many other charitable partners, so that anyone who gives a donation to charity can have the charitable tax deduction. State contracting to nonprofits and prompt payment would be a webinar we could spend half a day talking about, but we are advocating for the state to pay their bills to the nonprofits that they contracted to provide services, period. It's not happening, and it's putting our nonprofits in a state of crisis. And finally, childcare investments are going to be critical as we move forward with whatever happens with the rest of the federal stimulus and jobs and reopening. Childcare is really important for us to pay attention to. If you're interested in engaging on any of these matters, you can follow United for Alice and United Way New York State on Twitter. We typically pre-announce advocacy opportunities, sign-on letters, and tweet storms, phone banks, and virtual lobby days ahead of time. So that's the best way, in addition to subscribing to your local United Ways newsletter, which is my next and last slide. Locally in your communities, you can help Alice by engaging with your local United Ways. United Way of the Dutchess-Orange Region, United Way of Rockland County, United Way of Westchester and Putnam. Their websites are linked here. You can have my slide deck. You can have a recording of this webinar as well. Make it very easy for you to get in touch with your local United Ways. And that concludes my formal presentation. I'm going to kick it over to Tom, who is coordinating the chat box with leaders from your local United Ways today to answer some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Brenda, for leading this discussion this morning. And of course, thank you to my colleagues from the United Ways in Rockland and the Dutchess-Orange region, especially Dana Tracy, Melissa Clark, Emily Darrow, Jeannie Montano, and from here in Westchester and Putnam, Faith Butcher. And finally, thank you all for joining us this morning. It's clear there's a long road ahead for our communities, but as Robert Frost said, the best way out is always through. So Brenda, you have actually nailed all the questions as they've been coming up. The only one that I see that you have not answered is there was a question posed that said, do immigrants that live in the shadows due to legal status, were they part of the methodology used for Alice?
That's a great question. And I don't readily know the answer to it. So I'm going to reach out to the research team and see if I can get a very specific answer, unless Joe or Mary, who's on the call, does know the answer to that. Tom, can you make sure we please have the contact information for the person asking the question? We'll also include the response to it to the general follow-up to everybody so that everybody has the answer to that question.
Absolutely. And yep, it doesn't appear to be any other questions that are in the chat box that you have not addressed.
I just really appreciate people sharing their thoughts during the presentation. It just validates, everybody knows we all know Alice. We all know what that struggle feels like. So how do we shine a light on this population so we can make sure we do not leave them behind again in our recovery? Tom, there was a question for the local United Ways about, can you identify, from the Poughkeepsie Journal, can you identify what factors are causing the disparity between demographics such as Black and Hispanic households, and what is being done to address the disparity? From the Alice research perspective, I can tell you that the Alice report and data itself is a data report. So if they don't extrapolate reasons why, that really becomes community discussion. And so I'm not sure if one of you wants to take that question. We measure the disparity and we can show you what it is. As far as what is being done, that would be a question we would say back to your local communities. What are you doing about Black and Hispanic households under 25, and single female headed households, which are disproportionately impacted? And some folks are muted. And also, this is someone from Poughkeepsie Journal, I believe. So perhaps we can introduce you directly to your local United Way team in Poughkeepsie, who administers the Empire State Poverty Reduction Initiative there. And I know they're working on this issue in a myriad of ways. I'm just not sure that they're in a position to speak out loud on the webinar right now about it.
Thanks so much, Brenda. And yes, Ryan and I have been working together. And I'm hoping everyone can hear me because I know my mic was being a little bit funny earlier. But I just wanted to thank you so much, Brenda, for an incredible presentation, and thanks to the 200 plus people that have tuned in today and asked so many great questions. And I just want to mention some of the work that we're doing, and that's a great question, Ryan. Our whole framework is around social and economic justice, and especially with everybody working together, we're trying to make sure that we're really focusing on equity like never before. We have our programs, when we go through and measure our programs that we work with are generally helping low-income households, female-headed households, children in our low-income communities. And we do this work with all of you. We've created a COVID relief fund, helped 100 projects that way. We've reframed our focus around COVID, this funding cycle, around housing access, food access, and after-school programming. We have daily or weekly pickups through our Day of Sharing program. And in fact, next week we have a financial stability presentation about managing money within your family that we hope all of you can be on as well. Even if you're not in our territory, we certainly invite you to join in. And Ryan, I'll certainly connect with you after the presentation as well. Thanks so much.
And that was Melissa Clark from United Way of the Dutchess-Orange Region responding to the question specifically regarding Poughkeepsie. Thank you.
Well, Brenda, it doesn't appear that there's any more questions. Someone had asked about—
There are a couple. Does the data report use information from the Census Bureau? In part, but there are, in part, but there are far more robust data sources that pull down even more information than the census. If you haven't done your census, please do it today. There's my little free and unscripted PSA, because we really need to pay attention to that right now. Mary Shaheen from United Way New York State did chime in to say that many of the questions on demographics and measures are answered in the methodology document. Again, in the website that is quite robust, and you can find all of the sources for the household budget items, as well as the household and demographic sources as well. And then Tom, a couple of times there have been questions about the recording. Can you remind folks before we go about what the follow-up is from here?
Absolutely. We will be sending a copy of the ALICE report, links to the website, as well as a link to the recording of this presentation out to everyone who registered later today. And then we're sure that each of your local United Ways will reach out to you with more specific information catered and curated for your specific counties. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to here in Westchester and Putnam, myself or Faith Ann Butcher, in Rockland, Dana Tracy, and in Dutchess-Orange Region, either Melissa Clark, Emily Darrow, or Jeannie Montano, who I don't believe is on this call.
She's here.
She's on her iPhone.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity. Keep up the great work.
Okay. If there's no other questions, we can't thank you all enough for joining us today. Again, Brenda, thank you so much for leading this discussion. And everyone, please have a wonderful day and stay safe out there.